Moving into ancient Egypt, today in the screencast, we're going to cover a little bit of some contextual information about Egyptian history a little bit, and then we're going to go into the first two slides for our content area. We're going to cover Narmer's palette and the seated scribe. Looking at our enduring understandings from AP College Board, the things you're going to want to be able to understand at the end of this content area is about the representation of royal figures, that they are divine figures. We're going to learn how significant a role religion and worship plays in both art and architecture. We're going to look mostly at dynastic Egypt and how it embodies a sense of permanence, and most of the things are created with the intention of moving into the afterlife. We're also going to look at their pantheon a little bit, which the polytheistic religious virtues, will come later when we really get into studies of Greece and Rome. But Egypt will definitely introduce us to some of the important gods and goddesses and polytheistic worship. Okay, starting with just this concept of longevity, needing you to understand how long the ancient Egyptian civilization lasted. We're looking at a civilization that was intact for more than 3,000 years. And the continuity that it showed over those 3,000 years is really impressive and something that Egypt is known for. Even though when we talked about Mesopotamia, Mesopotamia went through many different cultures and changes during their time period. The Near East had a lot of different types of civilizations kind of coexisting at the same time. Where with ancient Egypt, we're going to see a really intact civilization that has very little change that happens to them over this 3,000 year span. And just to help put that into more context, that's more than 15 times the age of the United States. Okay. And if you just think about, the life cycle of the United States, and think about over, our existence, how much culture has shifted and changed. I mean, just simply thinking 10 years ago, where we didn't have things like social media, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and just how much things changed so rapidly. And then to think of it as ancient civilization that existed for over 3,000 years, but had very strong continuum of culture. We also need to make note of geography, always making sure that you are aware of where we are located in the world, but also how that plays an important role in the civilization. So for Egypt, we are in the northeast part of Africa. We are across the Red Sea. Up here in this map, you can see where Mesopotamia is located between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. That's where we were. Now we're across the Red Sea, over here in this Egyptian territory. The geography is very rugged here, barren desert. Unlike Mesopotamia, Mesopotamia had some variety in their geography, but we really just have a lot of barren desert, except for the land just on either side of the Nile River. So this dark green area represents the Nile River Valley. This, just adjacent to it is kind of where we have our explosion of lush green that also allows for agriculture to be able to thrive here. The influence of this river cannot be overstated. I mean, honestly, without its presence, the civilization would not only be different, but it probably just wouldn't even exist here. The Nile River is what gave all life-giving features to this region, created fertile lands, and was able to, have water and irrigation. Um, Quite often, too, the Nile River is known for its kind of seasonal flooding, which again is what makes the area adjacent to the river kind of be able to thrive and be very lush and life-giving. It is really important to understand that the pharaoh, which is the king or the ruler of Egyptian civilizations, is not just a king. So the kings in Egypt were um, they were basically human kind of representations of the divine. And so you had like this terrestrial, um, you had this human who straddled this terrestrial realm and this divine God realm. So they kind of were able to, be this entity that was able to go into both realms. They were obviously living humans, but when they ascended to their throne, they would also embody the eternal office of kingship itself. So, what that means is that once they took the throne, that all of their kinship um, and basically their eternal life would continue to be a part of the throne. Okay? The Ka, or the spirit of the king, was often depicted as a separate entity standing behind the human ruler. So you would see images of, the actual human ruler, but then you would also see kind of representations of that human ruler almost in their like divine entity. Um, the divine aspect of the office of kingship was what gave authority to the human ruler, and the living king was always associated with the god Horus. We're going to go through a very basic family tree of some gods and goddesses, but the god Horus was the direct identifier for the king. Horus was the falcon-headed god who was believed to bestow the throne to the first human king. So quite often the pharaoh would have the depiction of the falcon head, and that would be that divine symbol of the pharaoh. But then we would also have statues and imageries of the human pharaoh as well. The Egyptian pantheon is so expansive, and that would be a course in and among itself, right? To be able to learn about all the different gods and goddesses and their representations and how they were worshipped. But to understand the images that we need to be able to analyze, um, we just need to kind of be aware of some of the primordial gods and goddesses of the Egyptian pantheon. um, Over here on the left, I have a simple family tree of the primordial gods, and basically it's kind of a breakdown from right here at the top of the tree, and then down here you have Horus, and Horus is kind of that intermediate god that connects all of these primordial gods to the king, which then the king is that that being that can be in both human and God realms. Okay, so all of these gods above that, the king, are your primordial gods and goddesses. They don't these are gods that don't descend to the earth, okay? The best way to get a good understanding of this family tree and some of their roles and how they were looked at and worshipped is to go to the slides and play this YouTube video. It is 13 minutes long. It's extremely to the point. There's no fluff, but it's very informative, and it will help you tremendously as we analyze the images under the Egyptian content. Everything that we look at two-dimensionally, three-dimensionally, and architecturally references these primordial gods in some way. So as we talk about the development of Egypt, it's important to know that it's kind of divided into different time periods and different eras. And the first division is, the pre-dynastic period to the dynastic divisions. So starting with pre-dynastic period, um, that was from about 5000 BCE until the dynastic period, which started in about 3100 BCE. So during that pre-dynastic period, I mean, you have your thriving Paleolithic and Neolithic groups. They're nomadic during Paleolithic times, and then they start to settle in smaller groups around that Nile Valley. And during pre-dynastic period, in terms of art and artifacts, we see things like ceramics, utilitarian ceramics. We see figurines. We see mace heads and other artifacts such as pallets that were used for grinding pigments. We've talked about that in the past when we talked about Lascaux, and we know that pallets were there to kind of act as like paint pallets where you would grind up and pulverize minerals from the earth and mix them with the binder and pretty much use that for paint. So this is along those same lines. We would use slate pallets for grinding pigments. Um, and and also those pigments now in Egyptian culture will also see used as like cosmetic and body decoration pigments. Um, we'll also see a lot of the beginnings of imagery that will develop and become very iconic and repeated during the dynastic periods. I think the other thing that's important to recognize, which goes for a lot of things in history, but the dynastic divisions, the titles and the eras that we name it, were not used by the ancient Egyptians themselves. That, these divisions were created later in the first Western style history of Egypt. Um, it's a way for modern cultures to look back at ancient civilizations and kind of categorize them. But it's important to know that these categories or these divisions or these eras was not how the ancients saw things and labeled things themselves. Okay. But the 33 kind of dynasties that we have included a series of rulers that were related by kinship, and the location of their seat and their power. Location literally meaning kind of like the city where the kingdom was kind of located at during that ruling. Um, Egyptian history is also divided into larger chunks known as kingdoms and periods. And again, this is just a way for historians to look back at ancient civilizations and make distinctions between such an expansive frame of time. I've put together a really basic grid here to show you some of the larger divisions. So we talked about the early dynastic period, and then this after the dynastic period, you have your dynasties beginning to develop, okay? And after the early dynastic period, we have then these kingdoms, and the kingdoms are referred to the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And I have them circled because in our image set for AP Art History, this is really where all of the images come from. And to be quite honest, it's mostly images that come from the Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom. There's not a lot of focus on the Middle Kingdom. We really don't cover much pre-dynastic at all in ancient Egypt. That is kind of covered during our prehistoric global art content area. So you're not going to see much of that. But in the early dynastic period, you have the first and the second dynasties, and this is actually where we will start, but we only have one image in this period. And in these dynasties, then the next cell here tells you who the ruler was. So we have King Narmer, and then the location of the ruling in the kingdom was in Thenis. In our Old Kingdom time period, so from about 2600 to 2100, we have the third, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth dynasties. Okay, so the kingdom is an overarching time period, and then you have dynasties within the kingdoms. Okay, those dynasties were ruled by Djoser, and the kingdom's location was ruled from the city of Memphis. In the Middle Kingdom, you have the 11th, 12th, and 13th dynasties. And then the ruler over that time period was Mentuhotep II. And here, then, ruling is happening out of Thebes. And then in the New Kingdom, from 1500 to about 1050, you have the 18th through the 20th dynasties. We have the rulers dedicated to Ahmose the First, and then we actually had multiple locations for this dynasty, but mainly located in Amarna. So what you need to understand is that these dynasties might be dedicated to Ahmose or Mentuhotep or Djoser, but there were, of course, many pharaohs within the Djoser dynasty, okay? And basically that is to represent all of Djoser's kinship, okay? So all of his sons, basically, that ruled thereafter. And it wasn't until you kind of had a kinship change that the title of the dynasty changed. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. What is important to understand about Egyptian art during its entire dynastic existence is its stability and its consistency. And this is really what I hope you take away the most. And I think a great way to understand it is comparing it to the ancient Near East, which, coexisted during the same period. And just from finishing that content area of Mesopotamia, you were able to see how many different types of civilizations in this Near East had lots of different approaches and styles of art and depictions and symbols. They really were kind of separate civilizations that had developed different values, different forms of worship, and then different ways for their imagery to represent that. Well, now we're talking about a long-running civilization where their values, their worship, and the symbols that represent it stay extremely consistent for over 3,000 years with very, very little change. And that is quite remarkable. I have images here that show this continuum. So over on the left, we have some imagery from Narmer's palette, which will be our first image that we go over. Um, but Narmer's palette was carved around 3100 BCE. And then if we look at um, carvings and images from temple walls 3,000 years later, you look at them and stylistically, they are almost identical. So with that being said, what you need to understand is why. Why is it almost identical? Did Egyptians just not grow and develop? Obviously, that's not the case. What is important to understand is the consistency throughout this history is the exact opposite. Their symbols, their gestures, the ways the bodies were rendered, it was extremely and 100% intentional. The Egyptians were completely aware of their consistency, but that's because they viewed it as stability, as divine balance, and clear evidence of the correctness of their culture. This is evidence that they were extremely confident that the way that they were doing things was correct and, thriving, bringing them great abundance and luck and promise in the afterlife. And then, therefore, why would you change that? Okay. So, in terms of, the consistency of their, cultural um, values and practices and symbolization, is because all of this had major impact beyond the image itself. So everything that they drew and that they carved, and all of these scenes inside tombs of deceased, they were depictions that had impact beyond the beyond the current life, and they basically had major impact for their afterlife. And if something changed, or if something wasn't right or accurate, it would have gross effects on their afterlife. So, for example, if there was a scene in a tomb of the deceased receiving food, or temple scenes of the king performing perfect rituals for the gods, okay? And if they were, if the image of the bread loaf was omitted from the deceased table, well, what that meant was they had no bread in the afterlife. If the king was depicted with an incorrect ritual implement on the tomb wall, then the ritual was incorrect and could have dire consequences in his afterlife. Therefore, there was no room for change. There was no room for mistakes, that everything needed to be extremely consistent, or the voyage into the afterlife would have really horrible effects. All right, we're going to be moving forward into our first two images, and they are coming from the Old Kingdom. And the Old Kingdom is a period of time that lasted from about 2575 BCE to 2150 BCE. We will have more images that are part of the Old Kingdom, but basically over these 400 years, Egypt was known to have a really strong central government and a very prosperous economy. There was a lot of growth and trade. during this time. And the Old Kingdom is also most famous that this was the time when many of the pyramids were erected. The Old Kingdom represents the transition from pre-dynastic period into dynastic period. And that, of course, will bring us to our first image for ancient Egypt. It is image number 13. It's called Narmer's Palette. It's from 3000 to 2920 BCE. It stands 2 feet tall, so 24 inches, and it is made from slate. This is a very significant Egyptian archaeological find. It is one of the earliest Egyptian kind of artifacts that we have. Um, and what's important is this kind of what's important to understand about this piece is it contains some of the earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions ever found. For this piece, the category of content is going to be most important. And actually, you're going to see some of that that content becomes very important in this entire Egyptian content area, because we're going to be looking at a lot of kind of narratives, and we need to be able to pause and observe to kind of understand the narrative and be able to interpret the story. I mean, we are looking at a pictorial depiction of history. And so pausing to really observe the pictures and the symbols within the pictures is what will unfold the story. And so Narmer's palette begins with, you know, a long um, a long pause to, you know, really observe and make sure that we notice everything that we see. So to do that, I have a kind of a black and white drawing of Narmer's palette, because sometimes that's easier to make out than some of these bas relief carvings. But I've split it to the left and the right. So going back here, Narmer's palette is one piece, but it is carved on both sides, okay? So here I have it in black and white for what we see on both sides. So we have the left side and the right side. So over here on the left side, what we have here, right here, this is Narmer, and he is wearing this cobra crown, which is a symbol of Lower Egypt at this time. Okay, so this is before dynastic periods. This is when Egypt was still kind of wasn't ruled by one king or pharaoh, but you had a lot of kind of coexisting groups of people all throughout this Nile region, right? And so for Lower Egypt, we had this crown, and you can see Narmer here is beheading the bodies of his enemies, okay? And in front of Narmer, you have 4 standard bearers. So we talked about standard bearers when we talked about our standard of ore. And so this is a great depiction of standard bearers who, you know, have these tall poles, and those on top of the poles are the heads of the enemies. We also have other attendants of Narmer around him. One of them is his priest, and the foot washers, or sandal bearers is sometimes what they call them. In the center here, we have these like mythological beasts. They're kind of like these lioness beasts. They have the body of a lioness with these very elongated necks that kind of twist around each other. And it's believed that these 2 beasts, which are trying to be tamed, are, you know, kind of twisting around each other, and this is supposed to symbolize that Egypt is being unified for the first time. Okay. At the bottom here, we have a symbol of a bull that is stepping, on the dead. So the bull kind of representing, the strength of Narmer and the defeating of the enemy. And we have the dead will always be debased by showing them as nude. In the four corners on both sides, so 1, 2, 3, 4, we have a repeated symbol of this kind of woman with, a cow horns. And there's different theories as to what this represents, possibly a goddess, maybe Narmer's divine mother, but also some people think that it's just another representation of a bull, which is part of to symbolize Narmer's strength. And then right here in the center, this is a hieroglyph, and this hieroglyph is thought to spell out Narmer's name. So we have that on both sides. Okay, so first forms of pictorial writing here. On the right hand side, what we see over here now is we have Narmer again, but we have the hawk. Okay, the hawk is the representation of the god Horus, and what we have here is the hawk that has a rope tied around the head of the enemy, and he's standing on the papyrus plant. That's what this symbol represents, and which is also a symbol of Lower Egypt. Okay, we have Narmer here in the center as the symbol of strength, because if we look behind him, now we are seeing the bull's tail. And then we also have a different crown on Narmer than we did over here on the left. And this is the crown that is the crown of a unified Egypt. We also have here the addition of the false beard, which is the symbol of the pharaoh. Okay. We have servants again that are holding Narmer's sandals, because see, now he is a divine ruler, so he is standing on sacred ground as a divine king. And then below again, we have nude figures. They are debased and they represent the defeated Egyptians. So this entire narrative story talks about King Narmer, who united Egypt and became, the first kind of pharaoh over a unified Egypt. Right? The other thing I want you to take extreme notation of is definitely that hierarchy of scale. So even though we have Narmer over here on a smaller scale, you can see how much larger he is than all of his attendants. And then the same here, we have Narmer, who is much larger than his attendants. In terms of context, we have the oldest Egyptian artwork in our image set. We have a piece of artwork that was found and located at an elaborate temple and grave site in the pre-dynastic capital. We have already stated these are the earliest hieroglyphics ever found, and that what it is commemorating, which is the unification of Upper and Lower Egypts, when Upper Egypt conquered Lower Egypt, and King Narmer then unified both of those regions. The function of this is quite interesting because it basically, it's a narrative and it's a monument, and it was probably meant to not only be something that was on display, but part of basically an educational monument. that signified an important moment in time. But instead of being on some type of stele or on some type of wall, it was put on this object called a pallet. And so what that is that it's a ceremonial copy of an everyday object. So typically a palette was what I stated earlier, where you would kind of pulverize powder and mix them with a binder to create a pigment. Specifically in Egypt, these palettes were made for cosmetics. And this right below is an example of a palette, but that a palette that was used as an everyday object. And so on one side, you have some decorative carving, but then on the other side here, you have this kind of inset, this circular inset, which acted as kind of, like if you would can picture like an eyeshadow palette or a blush palette. So in here, you would sprinkle some like charcoal powder and pulverize it and mix it with some sort of a binder, and then, it would turn into kind of this, paste form. And then from there, you would use that, for like the decorative black on the eyes and things like that. So, pardon me. So technically, this palette is a utilitarian object, but they used this utilitarian object and duplicated it to be this, ceremonial object. And you can see here, this kind of inset really kind of duplicates that cosmetic use of the palette. In terms of form, we have that bas relief carving, which we learned about in Mesopotamia. So it's a carving, but it's just, extremely shallow, okay? We have the repetition of Hathor, that is that kind of cow woman goddess, believed to be the goddess Hathor, but unsure. There's other theories that it could just be a kind of bull representation to pay homage to Narmer himself. But nonetheless, it is a repetition of the same symbol over and over again, which means that it's a repeated motif. We have figures that are standing on ground lines. We have hierarchy of scale, and along with hierarchy of scale, the wider or the broader the leg stance also represents power. We have composite figures. Please, please, please make sure you have made note of that. Let's go back and look. Look at this. Think back to Running Horned Woman, okay? Even though he's not running or in motion, we are able to see, the legs from a profile view. Then we have this twisting of the hip, so you can kind of see the front of the pelvic region. You can see the frontal view of the chest and the arms, but then we have the head turned again in a profile view. So when you have this combination of profile and frontal, that's your composite view, and that is repeated consistently through Egyptian art. And remember, this is all intentional. This isn't about being an inaccurate artist. This is about making decisions so that we could see all of the important parts of the human figure at once. We talked about debasement before, so now we have some real examples that we have the defeated dead figures are always naked. We have religious iconography. We have that through Horus, who's depicted as the raven. And then we have the use of line to represent contours. So basically, all of these images that we're able to recognize and understand they're developed by line, by edges, that that come together to create recognizable pictures and objects. Our next image is number 12. He's called the Seated Scribe. He's from 2620 to 2500 BCE. He is carved out of limestone and then painted. And I really love this figure because it is our first image where we are seeing a naturalistic sculpture. We're not seeing an image or a figure that is abstracted or stylized, but it's kind of our first naturalistic, really pushing for that realistic, type of reproduction. So in terms of content, what do we have here? Well, we have a seated figure, a male, who we note that his duties, his job, he was a scribe. In his hand, his left hand holds a papyrus scroll, and then in the other hand, possibly we believe a reed pen was located in that other hand. So we don't have that part of the sculpture anymore, but pretty sure that's what was located in the other hand. We have this figure wearing traditional Egyptian clothing, and we believe that this person was possibly some sort of kinship to the king, maybe a son or a grandson of the king. But we know that this scribe was never a king himself. For one, you would never see the king in this position. But also the fact that this person could read and write was a definite sign of importance. That reading and writing was not common, that even the king himself did not know how to read and write, and then the few people that could, they were deemed as very, very important attendants to the king, but not important enough to be divine. Okay. The function of this sculpture is actually a funerary object that was meant for the afterlife, and we'll talk more about that contextually. But that was the function. He was created with the intention to be a part of a tomb, to be a funerary object that had purpose for the afterlife. In terms of form, he was carved out of limestone, which was an abundant material in Egypt. Limestone has a very neutral color and is very kind of soft and lightweight. It's a good material for carving. Then these, these sculptures that were carved from limestone were then painted. And we have this person covered in a very reddish tint skin, and symbolically chosen for the skin color. Egypt has colors that represent gender. So the redder tones of the skin represent the males, and then the yellowish tones represent the females. You will see that in sculpture, but you will also see that in their narratives, in their wall carvings, in their papyrus scrolls. You will always see Egyptian figures represented with two different skin tones, and that symbolizes gender. Again, we have this beautiful naturalistic style, which is kind of something new for us, something very unique for this image. Make sure you make note of that. He is sculpted in three-dimensional form, meaning you can completely walk around him. He's finished on all dimensions, on all sides, but his composition, his the way that he's been arranged, he is still designed to be viewed frontally. There's no important information, on the sides or the back. We have that wonderful incorporation of negative space that we were able to make note of in Mesopotamia with the votive figures. So in between the torso and the arm, we have a negative space that's carved all the way through, in between the crossed legs, and underneath, his attire, we have negative space, that, kind of represents that virtual void. I gave you an image here to show you kind of what his sizing would be in real life, that, he is not he is not of human scale, that he is much smaller. The expression on his face is one of extreme attention. He's very focused. He's not expressionistic in terms of, showing some type of mood or feeling, but you can definitely get a sense that he's fully paying attention. The form of the figure is symbolic in terms of how his body was rendered. The belly and the chest show some representations of some fat, a little bit of some rolls, and kind of a bit of a belly there, and that is symbolic. What that is purposely designed to show, that this scribe was a sign of wealth and importance because he was able to eat well. So a little bit of the fat in the pecs and in the belly was a sign that he probably, was appointed to the king, was a part of the kingdom, was, an attendant that was taken very well care of. And we can see that because he definitely was able to eat quite well. The iris of his eye is actually rock crystal, so that's important to make note, that like our votive figures, where their eyes was inset with that shell, we kind of have the same situation here, where the eye was inset but with this rock crystal, and that crystal is so translucent that it really created this realistic interpretation of the eye, and really helped add to that kind of naturalistic feel. All right, so in terms of context, what were the beliefs with the Egyptians that caused them to create this funerary object? And so um, he was created specifically for a tomb in Saqqara, and the tomb was for an important official that we know named, his name was Kai. The word statue in Egypt literally translates to mean living image. So statues were considered to be kind of alive, and was the essence of one's ka. We mentioned ka before, and ka means like one's spirit or one's soul, right? And so the statues were like the living essence of one's soul, okay? So with that belief, many pharaohs and high-ranking officials would have their servants depicted in some form of image or sculpture, so that when the pharaoh died, or this high-ranking official died, these statues, okay, that embodied the ka of their attendants or their servants, were buried in their tombs with them. And then there was the belief that this spirit and this soul would travel to the afterlife with their pharaoh or with the high-ranking official, and then once they arrive to the afterlife, would be able to utilize their skills to now help them in their second life. And so this statue of the scribe embodied the soul of the scribe, and when buried with this official named Kai, once Kai was arrived in his afterlife, then his scribe was able to continue to do the same duties that he did in his mortal life. So that is the belief system behind creating these funerary statues, and therefore is what the cause of the function and motivation for the piece. Um, we know that this scribe was in a somewhat unusual pose. It seems that this pose is reserved for members of the immediate royal family, but like we said, not the king himself. But what we do know about scribes is that um, there were very, very few people within the civilizations that knew how to read and write. And so, because of that, they were highly regarded and very well paid. And scribes were needed for operations on all levels. Scribes were used for a multitude of things that involved kind of service to the kings and royalty, but also they were used for everyday Egyptian life. They would be the people used as tax collectors. They were in charge of organizing personnel for activities such as mining, trade, and war. They were used to work on projects like pyramid building. They would help record and communicate between rulers and Egyptian people. I mean, they were very highly utilized people, and therefore were seen as a highly respected person. And they were treated quite well, highly paid, and that's a lot of kind of what um, the rounded belly and the fatty pecs show, is that they were treated quite well in their lives. So that's going to end our first screencast on Egypt, giving you some background on Egypt, talking about our first two images. And as we advance, we'll start to get into some more of the Old Kingdom, specifically architecture and pyramid building.